Good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo. Some of the graphics today I should give credit to Terry Spataro for doing, and Bruce Lloyd had contributed in some work on AI support in exploring AI's descriptions of various theories of consciousness, which I did take advantage of in putting together some of what I did today. So thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Terry, both of whom are here today, on your help in putting this webinar together. And we're up to webinar number 8, or module 8, the future evolution of consciousness. And we're on the topic of theories of consciousness. Now, this is part 2. Part 1 I did back a few months ago, and it's available up on the YouTube channel if you want to look at it. But today we'll be doing part 2, theories of consciousness. And for those who are interested, up on my website are copies of all of the draft chapters so far that are parts of the book, The Future Evolution of Consciousness, which aligns with this webinar series. The chapter on theories of consciousness, which I just rewrote, is up on the website as well. And there are the URLs. Both of these URLs are on the outline that Terry put up in the chat room. And all of the previous webinars in this series are up on my YouTube channel, all 7 of them. In fact, there's 8 because there's one that's an interview with Leslie Combs back a while ago. But they're all up there. And this webinar, after I do it within some short period of time, will be up on the YouTube channel too, on this URL, which of course is in the outline as well. Now, what I'm doing in webinars 7 and 8 is I'm going through a very large sample of different theories of consciousness. And on the previous webinar, I put up the list of what different theories I would be talking about. Now, on this slide, notice on the left side, the theories identified up there are all in yellow. Those are theories or meta-theories often that I covered in webinar 7. So beginning today, we'll be moving on to the theories that are still highlighted or colored in turquoise. And there's obviously 7 or 8 there on this first slide, but there's all these other theories that I intend to get to as I go through this. So like I said, it may be that today we won't be able to finish up the entire list of theories of consciousness because you could see there's another, 20 on this second list that still need to be covered. Now, last time, if you recall, the place where I left off was a review of panpsychism. And I had discussed Galen Strawson's idea on panpsychism, and I also discussed Nagasawa's ideas on panpsychism. There's references with YouTube links for lots of these people and lots of their theories that are up on the outline. And so I went through Strawson and Nagasawa and micro and macro panpsychism. And I got down to cosmic panpsychism, where Nagasawa presents the argument that there is an intrinsic, fundamental cosmic consciousness that pervades the universe, and that's the interior, intrinsic essence of the cosmos, consciousness, and individuated consciousnesses, ours, are somehow fractured or separated off from the universal cosmic consciousness. And I came across two terms that appear in my reading to basically mean the same thing: cosmic panpsychism, Nagasawa, and cosmopsychism. And cosmopsychism, which is included in Kuhn's review of theories of consciousness, basically takes the view that the universe is a totality, has a single intrinsic holistic consciousness, and some kind of purpose or telos to it as well. And this is an idea that has shown up throughout history, and it's a variation on panpsychism. Now, I did not go into last time, and that's one of the ways in which I updated my chapter and updated this webinar on Philip Goff's version of panpsychism, which appears to be a cosmopsychism. And Goff is a contemporary philosopher. He's got YouTube's up if you want to listen to him. He, in fact, has a YouTube up where he interviews and discusses his views with Noam Chomsky on the nature of consciousness, and those are up on the outline. And Goff takes the view, which he derives from Bertrand Russell, the 20th century British philosopher, that physicality is the extrinsic view of reality. Consciousness is the intrinsic view of reality. So, looking at reality from the outside, it appears as matter. Looking at reality from the inside, it appears as consciousness. And this is basically a form of panpsychism, but it's also a form of the dual aspect theory of physicality and consciousness, that the physical and the conscious are just two different perspectives on the same thing, one from the inside, one from the outside. And where Goff draws from Bertrand Russell is Russell's argument, which I've been familiar with for a long time, and I think it's a very interesting and thought-provoking argument, that all of our science, physical science, only deals with and studies the behavior and effects of matter and energy, and not the intrinsic nature of matter itself. So physics and chemistry tells us nothing about what matter is or energy is intrinsically. All it tells us about is the effects and behavior that are observable of matter and energy. And Goff's argument is that the only first person acquaintance, that's us, that we have with the intrinsic nature of reality is in fact our individual consciousnesses. That consciousness is the intrinsic nature of our reality. And since consciousness is the intrinsic nature of our reality, Goff, says that the simplest view is to suppose that everything has this intrinsic nature, and not just humans or animals who have nervous systems. Everything possesses this inner reality of consciousness. And just to, again, repeat the basic argument of panpsychism, the basic argument is that consciousness is something that pervades, indeed, is intrinsic to everything within the universe. Therefore, for example, a rock is conscious. It's just at a much lower level of consciousness. But the intrinsicality of a rock is consciousness, or the intrinsicality of my desk is consciousness, or of a river is consciousness. So that's panpsychism. And the appeal of panpsychism has always been that it is able to get around the problem of dualism, of how consciousness could arise from physical matter by presenting the view that consciousness is something that's there in everything right from the get go. It's simply what the intrinsic nature of existence is. And the extrinsic nature of reality is what we refer to as the physical realm. But everything that we see in the physical realm intrinsically has consciousness. And Goff's argument is that since we intrinsically are consciousness, let's just assume that everything is. So I just wanted to add in that point about Goff at the end as another contemporary thinker, along with Nagasawa, who are advocates of panpsychism, even though it sounds like a strange position to argue that rocks are conscious or that and I want to think of whatever graphic examples you can come up with. Everything is conscious intrinsically. So let's move on from there, moving into new territory. Now, the opposite view, literally, that you could take about consciousness is not to say that consciousness is an intrinsic quality or essence or feature of reality, but it's a relational feature of reality. That is, consciousness is something that is somehow bound up with relationship and interaction as opposed to something intrinsic. And this comes in different forms. The relational, interactive, or even ecological way of thinking of consciousness. Consciousness is not isolated or contained in the biological body, but it's embedded in relationships and interactions between the body and the world. It is not a thing in itself, it is something that is a relational reality that emerges in interactions among biological bodies. Now, one way in which this gets stated, and it gets stated different kinds of ways, is in two very interesting, valuable books to read, one by a physicist, one by a philosopher, Lee Smolin, The Life of the Cosmos, and Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher, The View from Nowhere. Both of these books are very well known. And both of them take what they would describe as immersive participatory theories of consciousness. That is, consciousness is realized in the immersive engagement and intertwining of life with the universe. There is no absolute objectivity or there's no absolute position to stand anywhere and simply observe reality. The only way reality is consciously experienced is through immersive participation in it. And so our knowledge, our experience of reality is always predicated on this involvement and participation and interaction with reality, never being able to stand back from it and look at it, because the only way we ever experience is by being within it, in interaction with it. Now, another way that the relational view can be described is that the mind is not contained in the body. The mind is actually contained and realized in the interactive ecological gestalt of a body with tools in the world. So the mind or consciousness is not really in the head at all. Rather, the mind and consciousness is in the Gestalt relationship of bodies and the world. And there's three different interesting books I have up here: The Embodied Mind, Supersizing the Mind, and Out of Our Heads. I think that's, I can't see, I all of a sudden forgot the title of the third one, by Knowing. But the argument here would simply go like this. When, for example, you are writing an essay and either using a computer or using a pen and paper, where is the thinking going on? And the argument would be that the thinking isn't simply going on in your head, the thinking is going on in the ecological immersive interaction loop of the body, the pen, the computer, the tool, the material you're writing with. That is, thinking is not simply up here, but thinking is in the gestalt of the interaction. And consciousness could be in the gestalt of the interaction. I spent quite a bit of time last time talking about, or the time before that, the idea of reciprocity as an alternative to materialism, idealism, monism, and dualism, and that consciousness and physical matter are not distinct, but are actually reciprocals, and that the knower and the known are actually a reciprocity, a complementary, intimate engagement between consciousness and the world. So consciousness isn't something separate from the world. It's something that's only realized in a state of reciprocity with the world. So consciousness depends on physical reality, but physical reality is revealed and understood through consciousness. And now I'm going to come back to this idea in a lot more depth in the next chapter webinar on an ecological evolutionary theory of consciousness. But I wanted to just bring back in the idea of reciprocity, because reciprocity is going to involve a relational interactive theory. And I have up here an image of my a book that I wrote a long time ago on the reciprocity of the perceived environment. But the last person I want to mention, who is very well known, Martin Heidegger, one of the great existentialist philosophers of the 20th century, he also had a relational, interactive, immersive vision of consciousness articulated or expressed in his idea of Dasein. That is, we are beings in the world, that our fundamental reality is ourselves within a world, that is, the individual and the world are conjointly revealed. You can't separate oneself as a conscious being from the world in which the conscious being finds itself, but rather it is a unitary, singular reality of this immersion and revelation of me or I in the world. So whatever consciousness is not something separate from or distinct from the world in which the conscious being finds itself, because the conscious being finds itself in its fundamental form as embedded in the world. There's no me independent of the world, or no conscious me independent of the world. So that's another version of this relational idea, Heidegger's. Now, I'm just sampling here, but the main thing to get with this idea is that instead of thinking of consciousness as an intrinsic reality, consciousness is actually a relational reality and cannot exist except in a state of relationship with the world in which consciousness arises or exists. So instead of it being intrinsic, consciousness is relational, consciousness is interactive, consciousness is something ecological. So that's going in a different kind of direction than either the panpsychists or the dualists or even the idealists who treat consciousness as something which is an intrinsic quality or dimension to existence. Now, the next theme I wanted to bring in here, because it comes up quite frequently and it's important to acknowledge it and consider it, is that when we look at different theories of consciousness, you could divide theories of consciousness between those which are naturalistic versus those which are supernaturalistic. Now, what I mean by that is naturalist theories, which would include materialist theories, but could also include panpsychism for that matter. Consciousness is something which exists in nature. It has natural causes. We can come up with a naturalistic explanation of consciousness, and that view is opposed to supernaturalism, which has been a very popular view in understanding consciousness, which is that consciousness is composed of and originates from a realm beyond nature. And science cannot understand consciousness because the origin and nature of consciousness exists beyond the world of nature that science studies. Now, you might want to ponder how valid this distinction is. And I put this distinction up here, but I do sometimes wonder how clear this distinction is. Like, if I believe that there is some transcendent supernatural God which created supernatural souls, of which I am one and you each are one, and these souls are what possesses consciousness, does this treat consciousness and conscious souls and God as something transcendent to the world of nature? Well, depending on how you want to look at it, you could say yes. But some people will see God and souls as part of nature. I think the distinction, although valid, is a little fuzzy wuzzy as to what you include in nature and what you don't include in nature. But there are lots of people who have taken the view, excuse me, that humans possess souls, which is a concept which is connected with the idea of spirit. And a soul is a personal, unique spirit. And the term spirit could be understood as a power or agency that is not physical. And plenty of people believe in all kinds of different spirits. But the idea of a soul is that the soul is the source of consciousness, the soul is transcendent to nature, and it's not physical, and that it has an origin that goes beyond nature itself. This view is also connected with, it's not connected, this view also provides a foundation for a belief in immortality of the soul. Because if the soul is somehow transcendent to nature, beyond the world of change and life and death, then maybe the soul is immortal. Okay? The belief that the soul as something distinct from the body continues to exist past the point at which the body dies. So there are lots of different versions and variations on this idea that consciousness owes its origin to a supernatural soul created in a supernatural realm by a supernatural being, and that soul continues to exist after the body dies because the soul is fundamentally distinct from the body, which is part of nature. Now, another thing to bring up about this idea, which is worth considering, is I presented the argument early on that um, the theory of consciousness that we adopt will have implications regarding how we see the future of consciousness. And that is depending on the theory of consciousness we have, we can draw different kinds of implications. If we think of consciousness as a supernatural, transcendent reality lodged in a supernatural soul, which will continue to exist after the body dies, that clearly is presenting to us a particular view on the future of consciousness. That as consciousness is going to continue, it's going to continue in a non-physical form at a transcendent realm and in line with lots of people's beliefs, it will continue that way indefinitely, eternally, immortally, whatever. So it'd be an interesting question to ask yourself, you know, am I naturalist about consciousness or am I supernaturalist? Do I believe that the source of my consciousness somehow is independent of and continues to exist past the existence of my physical body? And if I change my view of consciousness, how would that change what I see as the future of consciousness, either my consciousness or consciousness as a whole? Now we're going to go in a different direction because here's another cluster of ideas about consciousness that basically developed in psychology as opposed to either in spiritual thinking or in a philosophy. Although the distinction between psychology and philosophy is often a bit blurred. Now, a lot of people may not be aware of this character, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a psychologist philosopher named Franz Brentano. There's a picture of him up there. And Franz Brentano formulated what came to be referred to as act psychology. This is late 19th century. And the fundamental argument is that consciousness is not a thing, rather, consciousness is an activity. It's a doing as opposed to a thing like essence. And consciousness has a fundamental feature to it, which Brentano called intentionality. And what intentionality means is that consciousness is always a consciousness of something. Like I'm conscious of the color red. I'm conscious of my anger. I'm conscious of my thoughts. I'm conscious of memories. I'm conscious of another person. That is, consciousness is never a pure thing in and of itself, since it's always of something. Now, some consciousness is purposeful, and so consciousness can have goals. Purpose is often referred to as um, a type of intention or intentionality. I intend something. But it's important to keep in mind that Brentano's concept of intentionality is actually broader. It simply means that whenever there is consciousness of something. Consciousness in and of itself is incomplete And so there's no pure consciousness. This became a very influential idea in psychology, and Brentano's act psychology became very influential. It led to the idea of functional psychology or functionalism. That is, consciousness is what consciousness does. So instead of saying, what is consciousness? We say, what do we do with consciousness? What are its functions? And a strong advocate of functional psychology was the great American psychologist William James. And William James looked at what the functions of consciousness are. So notice consciousness is being thought of in terms of doings, activities, things that are accomplished. And I should note that the prime example of a functional approach to the mind was Aristotle. So when Aristotle asked the question about the psyche, the form of the body, Aristotle's conception of the psyche was in terms of the capacities or functions of the body. Aristotle was a functionalist, and James was as well too. Now, one idea that comes out of functionalism, and just keep in mind again now, consciousness is not a thing, consciousness is a doing, an activity. That's the difference here. One of the things that came out of functionalism developed was the representational theory of consciousness. What does consciousness do? What consciousness does is it makes representations and models of reality. So consciousness creates images, creates explanations, creates narratives, creates models, creates simulations about reality. That's what consciousness does. So consciousness has as a fundamental function to represent reality. This leads into the indirect theory of perception, that when we perceive things, what we are perceiving are representations created in consciousness of the world. We don't see the world, we see the representations we create. Thought is nothing but abstract representations of the world. And it's connected back to intentionality theory, in that consciousness involves creating representations of something. That's what consciousness does. Simulations, abstract representations of the world, even representations of ourselves. We come up with ideas about ourselves. We create models, whether it's visual or linguistic, of ourselves. But as I mentioned, this leads to this idea that there's a world out there, the tree, for example, and in the mind is a representation of the tree out there. And that's what consciousness is, these internal representations of the external world. Now, even though I don't support Bishop Berkeley's idealism, I think Bishop Berkeley hit upon a very fundamental criticism of a lot of different kinds of theories of consciousness when he pointed out that if you believe that your consciousness is some kind of internal representation of something that exists beyond your consciousness, the actual reality, but according to your theory, all you ever are aware of are your internal states or representations that you create of this external world, then the external world in your theory becomes a totally meaningless idea. And so that's where Berkeley ends up with his idealism. Everything must be consciousness. So the representational view ends up going with the notion that all we're ever acquainted with directly are our representations of a world that we never can consciously experience in and of itself. But it's a very pervasive view of consciousness that consciousness creates representations of the world. Now, also going into early psychology, because early psychology, before behaviorism came on the scene, was basically early efforts to create a science of consciousness. Psychology from the 1870s to the 1920s. If you ask psychologists what do they study, they would have said they study consciousness. But they had different theories of what consciousness was. Now, I've introduced you to Brentano, act psychology, functionalism, representationalism. But contemporary with Brentano, and probably actually the more influential view, was what came to be referred to as structuralist psychology, which studied consciousness. Now, the two main spokesmen for structural psychology or structuralism were Wilhelm Wundt, there's a picture of Wundt up there, and the first psychology laboratory ever created was Wundt's in the 1870s. There he is sitting, an old man with some of his graduate students. And one of his most significant spokespersons or followers, Titchener, down below in Titchener's book, Systematic Psychology. Now, what Wundt and Titchener thought about consciousness was that through introspection, one could analyze the content of consciousness. Now, if you stop and yourself engage in some introspection, you'll notice that there are all different kinds of qualities or elements, features to what you are conscious of, from redness to sweetness to memories to emotions to thoughts to images of imagination. All of that in Wundt's mind was part of the content of consciousness. And the function of psychology through introspection was to analyze all of consciousness into its fundamental elements in the same way in which physical sciences analyze physical matter into its fundamental elements. And that's exactly what Wundt thought. Psychology, which is the science of consciousness, is literally the chemistry of the mind. That is, we're going to figure out what the fundamental units are of consciousness. This derives off of David Hume's phenomenalist philosophy that consciousness consists of a collection of impressions, sensory impressions, and ideas. The whole notion of qualia, which is a contemporary idea in the study of consciousness, is basically derivative from this content view of consciousness. Qualia are simply the elements of content of consciousness, whether they are redness or sweetness or loudness or whatever other qualities presumably one is aware of when one is conscious. And Wundt and Titchener were simply out to try to describe in full, then, to use modern terminology, the qualia of consciousness. So instead of thinking of consciousness as an activity, they thought of it as consisting of this rich content of qualia that could be analyzed through introspection, but you had to be trained in this. And that would provide a systematic description of the entire scope of consciousness. Now, the opposite view, which I had already introduced, was that consciousness wasn't these elements, these qualia. Rather, consciousness was an activity, was dynamic in some way. That was the act theory. As I mentioned before, William James, being influenced by X psychology, who was a functionalist, wanted to describe consciousness as a process, as a verb, as a flow, as an activity. And Leslie Combs, who was on one day when I was interviewing Leslie, we were talking about consciousness. Leslie has taken this view too, deriving it from William James. That is, it isn't so much that consciousness is content, consciousness is flow. In fact, going back to William James, um, consciousness, the flow of it can be seen as a pulsation of momentary perchings of attention on something and then flights, a jump to something else. Basically, it's the notion that as a critique against the structuralists, consciousness is not a thing. It isn't composed up out of things or substances. It isn't a noun. It is something flowing, fluid activity. Now, interestingly, in some ways, James, David Hume, and the ex psychologists line up with the Buddhist theory of consciousness, of which, of course, there are diverse expressions. Consciousness is seen as a continual transitory flow of awareness, as a process. The self is even a process and transitory. Each moment of consciousness is something new arising from past influences. There is a ongoing transformative quality to consciousness. It's not a thing, it's not a substance, it's not a noun. And we could attune through mindfulness to this flow. And we can, in fact, even become liberated from it. But the idea of flow, of activity, isn't simply something in the West, it's something that you see in the East and Eastern thinking on consciousness. Now, coming back to the contemporary philosopher who I've mentioned on several occasions, Galen Strawson, and if you get a chance sometime, go watch one of his YouTube interviews. He's an interesting and fascinating character who is a contemporary philosopher of mine. And Strawson, in thinking about this notion of flow and the flow of consciousness, in his book, The Subject of Experience, presented the idea that consciousness, and this in some ways is going to sound similar to William James with perching and flights, consciousness is a pulsation. So there will be a momentary configuration of awareness, and then there'll be a jump, a abrupt transformation to a new momentary configuration of awareness. And these are discrete pulsations. So even though it feels as if consciousness is continuous, consciousness actually is pulsatory. And we don't notice the gaps in the pulsation because there's no consciousness there. So we keep configuring new states of consciousness, what he calls the seismic theory, and then a new configuration of consciousness, and then another one. But each one is a distinct pulsation. So just like the heart goes boom, 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 consciousness goes boom, 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 boom. It pulsates. And that's the flow. So those are some ideas on content psychology, structuralism, the study of qualia, how qualia emerged in the structuralist ideas. In fact, it emerged with David Hume. Consciousness is a dynamic activity as opposed to a thing consisting of qualities. How this compares up with the East as well as in the West. Now, a lot of you probably heard and have some thoughts about the term phenomenology. And phenomenology was a philosophical method that developed around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, which was a method used to study consciousness. Now, to notice the historical connections in all of this, the advocates of phenomenology, beginning with Edmund Husserl, who coined the expression, and the people who he influenced, Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and the Gestalt psychologists, Husserl actually drew his ideas from Brentano. Husserl was a student of Brentano and Brentano's act psychology. What Husserl wanted to create was a method for describing first person, subjective, meaningful, lived consciousness that would be a holistic description of the nature of consciousness. And he called that discipline phenomenology. So if I say I want to give a phenomenological description, what I mean is I want to describe the actual experience of consciousness and all of its richness and its subjectivity, but with in its meaningfulness from a first person point of view. So that's what Husserl was intending to do. And I have up here his general introduction, his book Ideas to Phenomenology, a collection of essays about Husserl. People talk about phenomenology a lot, but to study these people, including Husserl, is a bit of a challenge. When I was an undergraduate, I took an independent study course where I studied Husserl and studied phenomenology, and I came to the following conclusion. Husserl's idea that one can give a pure description of consciousness, a phenomenological description of consciousness, that is non-interpretive, non-influential, non-biased, but is simply looking at it for exactly what it is never going to work. Because every effort to describe our consciousness is always going to be influenced by our theories, our concepts, our interpretations, our particular points of view. The idea that there is a phenomenological given, a raw, unfiltered, uninterpreted consciousness, which is what Husserl is trying to achieve, that is the idea of a given, to me seems to be philosophically and psychologically impossible. That is, even if I might say that I'm simply trying to describe my consciousness and I'm not interpreting it in any kind of way, baloney, I would say. You're interpreting it somehow. There's interpretive ideas in there. There's concepts in there, okay? And in fact, one could be, let me put it a different way. You can't be absolutely certain about the descriptions you provide of your own consciousness. People could be willfully inattentive to certain features of their own consciousness, or not notice certain features of their own consciousness. Why do we have such trouble among ourselves trying to describe consciousness? So, because presumably it's right in front of all of us, except we come up with different descriptions. This isn't some easy thing to simply look at and say, ah, that's what consciousness is. We have different interpretations that are given of it. So the materialist argument, which I presented back last time, that the idea that we possess consciousness the way we think we do may in fact be an illusion because of our primitive mindset. This is a materialist argument that the notion that there is consciousness may be something that is a reflection of the level of our understanding of reality. And it may be an illusion, and in fact, maybe all this is just simply states in the brain. But the important thing to keep in mind there, and it's important, it's something I keep reminding my own self about, is that Tom, you try to be attentive to describing your own consciousness, but you got to keep in mind that this is your description and it's being influenced by your concepts, your interpretations of things, and you can't present the notion that this is purely non-inferentially, non-interpretive reality of consciousness, because I don't think you could do it. Because consciousness inherently itself, which is what we're using to describe consciousness, is inferential, interpretive, and filled with all kinds of aspects of our own experience that come into play when we actually reflect on ourselves. But the idea of trying to give phenomenological descriptions, holistic descriptions of consciousness, which is what the phenomenologists are trying to do, I think it's an idea that's worth thinking through, pursuing. Instead of analyzing consciousness, look at the total gestalt of it. And out of phenomenology, aside from existentialism with Sartre and Heidegger coming out of phenomenology, Gestalt psychology emerged out of German phenomenology. And the Gestalt psychologists were totally against the structuralists who thought consciousness could be analyzed into pieces. Rather, the Gestalt psychologists believed that consciousness consisted of structured, meaningful wholes, that the only way you can get an understanding of consciousness is to look at the gestalt of it. In fact, they would argue that to look at the brain, you got to look at the gestalt of it. You can't look at the brain as a set of isolated, localized entities. And all the parts of our experience are interactive, and the wholes of our experience are interactive. And the Gestalt psychologists emerged back in the 1920s and 30s, and they were anticipatory of the whole holistic systems way of thinking of contemporary times. They were the ones who first articulated a holistic systems theory approach to reality and to consciousness. And the Gestalt psychologists added a lot into our understanding of consciousness because they wanted to look at consciousness holistically as opposed to try to analyze it into pieces, into parts, which they thought when you did that, you would miss the total reality of it because you've broken the parts apart. And of course, people always will quote the Gestalt statement, which I think it came from Wertheimer, who was the first of the Gestalt psychologists. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. That's an expression from Gestalt psychology. Although Wertheimer said, well, that's not quite the right way to say it. It isn't that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The whole is not the sum of its parts. So it's about 5 after 11 right now. This may be a good place to take a break, right? So I could, let's see. Now let me move on to the concept, theory, principle of evolution, and all the different ways, not all, but at least some of the different ways in which the theory of evolution has had an impact on different theories of consciousness. And I have up here a quote from Julian Huxley. Man is a product of nearly 3 billion years of evolution, in whose person the evolutionary process has at last become conscious of itself and its possibilities. Now, I've run across quotations from Huxley, which basically come down to that consciousness is the means by which evolution becomes aware of itself. And however you want to put that, because this other quote is sounding somewhat similar, lots of people have seen evolution as being a very critical fact in considering the nature of consciousness. So we're going to go through some examples. There's too many, but I'm going to go through some. Uh, Evolution is not intrinsically a theory of consciousness, but it's influenced different theories. Daniel Dennett, who I brought up before, as a materialist theory of consciousness, he presents the argument that consciousness is a result of natural selection, and that there is a temporal and progressive dimension to consciousness. That consciousness in some manner or form has been evolving. Now, one version is evolutionary dualism, which is that consciousness emerged in evolution through the evolution of complexity in the universe at some point when the complexity of the physical world achieved a level generating this new kind of reality consciousness. Or simply evolutionary materialism, that consciousness has evolved with the evolution of complexity in the brain, and consciousness is not something distinct from the brain, but clearly is connected with the evolution of complexity in the brain. At the far out reaches of this, we have people like Teilhard de Chardin, Olaf Stapleton, and Frank Tipler, who have argued in different forms that consciousness is evolving towards some kind of holistic apex or asymptote into a global mind or a cosmic mind, and that the saga of consciousness is just beginning, and that eventually the entire universe is going to be coordinated by this evolved this cosmic consciousness, which will emerge in over a long, long period of time. Different people, including Julian Huxley, have argued that consciousness actually will come or has come to drive the evolutionary process itself. That is, consciousness is a self-reflectivity on evolution, and that it is engaging the very process of evolution and is guiding it and will continue to guide it in the future. So consciousness, having evolved, flips back on the reality from which it evolved, reflects on it, and begins to guide the process forward. And this is going to align with what I've said before about purposeful evolution, that we are engaged through future consciousness and purposeful evolution of ourselves in the universe. Now, then we get a different kind of evolutionary thinking on consciousness, which I'll use Ray Kurzweil as an example of, that we will eventually realize a technological singularity, which is a consequence of the acceleration of evolution, across the entire history of the universe with technological evolution that's ongoing now, achieving a rate of increasing complexity much faster than anything before. And we will hit the technological singularity, which is Venor Vinge's idea back from the 1990s, where general artificial intelligence will exceed human intelligence and consciousness, and a new level of consciousness will be realized. And that general artificial intelligence, if it realizes consciousness that is fundamentally, colossally beyond our consciousness, will drive further evolution of consciousness as a natural evolutionary consequence. Meaning that um, evolution is somehow responsible for the emergence and development of consciousness, but the emergence of consciousness allows the system to reflect upon itself and actually accelerate its own continued evolution. And when we get to general artificial intelligence, we will have a form of consciousness and intelligence. If general artificial intelligence possesses consciousness, will speed up the process of evolution even more so. So, those are some evolutionary ideas, but there's more. I had already mentioned Sri Aurobindo, and I'm describing him as a multi level participatory evolution of consciousness, where his basic idea is that the foundational level of reality, the supermind, if I understand him correctly, involves into the physical world, and then consciousness evolves within that reality, which has been created out of the supreme mind, the supramental divine consciousness, the underlying pervasive unified consciousness of the cosmos. And it goes through stages, consciousness. And here's where we're introducing this idea, and I'm introducing it with a Hindu, but it's still a common idea both in the East and in the West, that consciousness evolves through stages. So, to elaborate a little more on the evolutionary thesis, that is, consciousness evolves, but it evolves through stages. And Sri Aurobindo identifies what he thinks are the various stages in this evolutionary process, moving from matter to life to the rational mind to integral mind, etc., etc. The ultimate destination of this is a eventual level of harmonious unity in the cosmos. That separateness is an illusion. Now, we've come across this idea already, and this is a fundamental theme in metaphysics. Are distinct things really distinct, or is everything simply a one? But he sees eventually in the history of humanity the supermind infusing itself into a transformed earthly reality, a supramental transformation of human nature. Not an escape from the world, but he puts it a divination of the world. Now, I should note here on this idea that that our earthly realm will eventually be transformed as we realize a resonance with the supermind is very similar to St. Augustine in the city of God, which is a Western idea that the city of God is going to be a transformation of our earthly being, our physical bodies, into a more refined and elevated reality. I do want to mention, and Sri Aurobindo includes in ways to facilitate evolution. toward this ultimate unity, reunification with Brahman. Do want to mention two things. Again, what does a theory of consciousness say about the future of consciousness, depending on the particular theory? But the second thing is, even though Sri Aurobindo wants to pull together here various Asian Indian ideas with evolution, and he definitely did, he definitely stated that as a goal. He still ends up with a circular theory here of first we have the cosmic oneness, the unified absolute consciousness, which involves through a series of stages that eventually lead back to a reunification with the ultimate unified consciousness. So it goes in a circle. Now, I'm going to get to Richard Gauthier, who's here today. Victor, I don't know if I'll get to you because you're a little bit further along in the sequence. But I also had previously mentioned Sakar's ideas about consciousness when I talked about Sri Aurobindo and the idea of moving from the limitless consciousness to limited consciousness back to limitless consciousness, which is the same idea here, the same circular process of evolution. And hold that thought. But I wanted to include, in addition here, that Sakar did put a lot of energy and effort and articulation into developing various implications, literally action plans, regarding how to facilitate social psychological evolution and progress in humanity based on his ideas about reality and consciousness, involving moral principles, involving a balanced development of inner consciousness with our life out in society. And so I think it's important to note, like with Sri Aurobindo, with Sakar, with other people to come, that efforts are made to take the theory and apply it practically to the future of consciousness. Now, Richard Gauthier, who's been attending the webinar series and is a scholar and a practitioner of Sakar, had recently presented, wrote an article on how Sakar's theory of consciousness solves the hard problem. And I just wanted to mention it here. Richard's article, the link, I have it, but I forgot to send it to Thierry, but I can, it's in the outline. So it's in the outline. You can get the URL there if you want to read it yourself. And as Richard understands Sakar, when Sakar came to the question of the relationship between our consciousness of the world and the physical world around us, Sakar's argument is that the physical world transmits physical waves of quality to the brain, which are transformed to mental simulations of qualia at what he called appropriative points or portals in the brain. Now, one thing I pointed out to Richard when I gave him a little feedback on it was the idea that the qualia, the sensory qualia, what contemporary philosophers of consciousness refer to as qualia, like redness and sweetness, etc., in Sakar's theory, are not created in the brain, but are actually qualities of the physical world. I said that, yes, I think I might agree with that part. But Sakar does believe that the actual physical object is only truly perceived by the cosmic mind. What we get is a simulation of it. Okay. But it is a rejection of the long-standing view that colors and tastes and other sensory qualities are not qualities of the external world, they're secondary qualities, whereas length and shape are primary qualities and are actually qualities of the external world. Um, and I brought up to Richard when I talked to him about this that I tend to be of the view, which is similar to what Richard is presenting here, that in fact uh, the qualities, the content of our consciousness, at least some of it, is not really generated in the brain at all. And it is not simply qualities of consciousness, but are actually qualities or features of the external world itself. And I'm going to come back to that later on, but that is a point of resonance between what Richard presented and what I will talk about a bit later on, probably in a different webinar than today. But if you want to look at Richard's article, and then Richard has a further response because I told him that this theory doesn't solve the heart problem, but he wrote a response to it, which I haven't read yet. But the heart problem, in fact, the way it often gets framed, seems to be very challenging and difficult to try to figure out or resolve. But be that as it may, it's up there. But there's other evolutionary theories too that I wanted to mention here. Ken Wilber, integral theory, but it turns into another circular theory. Consciousness evolves through stages from separation of the individual consciousness from unity back to unity. He attempts to synthesize, like Surya Aurobindo did. In fact, Wilber was influenced by Surya Aurobindo, science and Eastern religion. Wilber identifies various evolutionary historical stages from pre-personal to personal and transpersonal. He sees non-dual awareness as the highest. Lots of people think that, which is that the highest level of awareness is going to see everything as a oneness. All previous stages get integrated as you evolve up through the stages. There are developmental levels that occur, which are evolutionary levels from the egocentric to the ethnocentric to the world centric to the cosmocentric. Again, these are ideas about stages in the development or evolution of consciousness. And Wilber strongly identifies with evolution, but at the same time, I think he still is arguing, like a lot of the others do, that evolution just simply leads back where you started from, which I don't agree with. By the way, I should mention also Frank Tipler, who thinks the universe evolves into a conscious cosmic mind at the end of the evolutionary process. He also, Tipler thinks that conscious cosmic mind at the end of the universe jumps or time travels back to the beginning of the universe to set the conditions for its own evolution. So consciousness literally lifts itself up by its own bootstraps. Um, James, who I mentioned before, is another evolutionist who thinks that ancient consciousness is different than modern human consciousness, that ancient human consciousness was outer directed by experienced deities with no volitional experience of self responsibility or a modern self. So even though James often gets criticized by various historians and psychologists, he also has got a lot of attention for this, that our notion of the modern self and self responsibility is something which is more recently evolved. And it wasn't there back 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So, again, I have at the end here, do theories of consciousness present or imply theories of advanced consciousness or the evolution or preferable evolution of consciousness? And there's plenty of illustrations above, but they don't all explicitly do that. And so one thing that I would state as being a plus point, even if I don't agree with the particular theories of consciousness of Wilbur, Aurobindo, Sakar. At least they make efforts to try to take their theories of the nature of consciousness and develop practices and ideas regarding the future evolution of consciousness based on those fundamental theoretical ideas. Now, the next cluster I wanted to come to was the idea that consciousness is emergent. It's a theme that comes up repeatedly in different ideas on consciousness. Now, a distinction is often made here between strong and weak emergence. Strong emergence is the argument that you can't predict in principle qualities, entities, or laws at successive evolutionary levels of higher complexity in the hierarchy of nature. That means that strong emergence presents the argument that as the universe has evolved, there are things that will appear, come into existence, that you never would have been able to predict from the previous, more primitive level of evolutionary development. And if you recall back from my earlier uh, webinar on evolution, I think that I would tend to identify myself as somebody who believes in strong emergence. I think it repeatedly happens over and over again, where when we go up to a new level of complexity in the stages of the evolution of the universe, entities and processes and qualities appear that were unpredictable in principle from the more primitive, simple level below it. Now, the argument is going to be here that consciousness represents a strong emergence, that it's something that comes about that could never have been predicted from what preceded it. Now we have emergent evolutionary dualism, that the foundational universe is entirely physical, consciousness emerged at some sufficiently complex level in evolution, and it was unpredictable from the physical world below it. But it's that idea seems to run smack head on into the problem of dualism, which is we have this qualitatively totally different kind of reality which pops into existence, emerges in the process of evolution, and then seems to be able to both impact the physical world as well as being impacted by it, even if it's a totally different kind of reality. So evolutionary dualism, emergent evolutionary dualism, sounds plausible in one way, but it faces the problem of philosophical dualism. How did it happen? But more importantly, how could it possibly have an effect back on the physical world or be affected by it? We have a variation on that, which is holistic emergence, which is that consciousness is a complex, holistic reality that emerged through interaction and integration of simpler physical realities. And people have thrown that idea out too. By the way, I have three books up here, all of which deal with the issue of emergence or evolutionary emergence, all of which are very good books. Eric Chasen's Epic of Evolution, The Emergence of Everything by Harold Morowitz. Excuse me, I have a fly going around my head. And Reinventing the Sacred by Stuart Kaufman. Um, Now, one particular theme that comes up here, question, is the emergence of consciousness analogous to other levels of emergence and evolution, or qualitatively different? Is it simply another singularity jump in the evolutionary series of singularities? Now, this is the argument that Eric Chasen presents, that the emergence of consciousness is a singularity. It's a significant jump in the makeup of the universe. But Chasen presents the argument that it's not the first singularity, that there's been at least six or seven other ones prior to it. And I'm referencing an article I wrote on this idea that is in my book, Essays on the Future of Psychology and Consciousness. And the name of the article is Consciousness, Cosmic Evolution, and the Technological Singularity. And it particularly discusses this notion from Chasen that consciousness or the emergence of it is the latest in a series of emergent levels of reality. And the next one is on the way, which is going to be the technological singularity. Now, let's do one last slide for today. It's just hitting 12 o'clock. And then we will do a final part to this series on theories of consciousness. Um, I could go a lot faster, but it's interesting to look at these. It's interesting to hear your comments. And so I apologize. This is turning into 6 hours. But like I said, it's just a lot of different ideas. Um, Feminist theories. Now, Kuhn does not include this in his survey, and I think it's important to bring in women writers specifically because there are certain distinctive themes that pop up in them. Um, but there's still diverse theories of mind and consciousness among women writers dealing with various related topics. The first one I want to mention is Rian Eisler. And here's a number of her books up there. The one that she became famous for at the beginning was The Chalice and the Blade, and presenting the argument that if we look back in her history, even into her prehistoric periods before 3000 BC, one identifies two different distinct modes of mentality and culture, a dominator versus partnership mentalities. The dominator mentality associated more with males, the partnership mentality associated more with women. And these two different mindsets, mentalities, modes of consciousness have conflicted with each other over thousands of years now. And the dominator male uh, centered mode of consciousness tended to hold sway over both Eastern and Western history, but Eisler sees a at least contemporary swinging back more toward a partnership mentality of reality. Now, um, two things about her. Number one, I did have the pleasure of listening to her and chatting with her at length. And Ryan Eisler is one of the most intelligent people I've ever run into. She's got an incredibly good mind. And uh, I went to a conference where she was there with a number of other philosophers, psychologists, and she was unequivocally the smartest, most educated, well informed of the bunch. Um, so it's definitely worth reading her. She's a very, very good mind, and she's a very well balanced mind on top of it all. A second woman writer who I have met, interacted with, and I think is very interesting is Maureen O'Hara, the same name as the movie actress. Although this Maureen O'Hara is an American psychologist, and she is presented in some of her papers, which are in those two books I show covers of, the theory that there are fundamentally two different types of self consciousness: the individualistic, egocentric self, which tends to be associated more with male minds and Western minds, and the relational, sociocentric self, which is more strongly associated with female or Eastern minds. And to note this distinction that she makes in ways aligns or resonates with Eisler's distinction between individual conscious beings who engage in partnership in relational cooperation with each other versus conscious beings who tend to want to stand above and manipulate others below them. And also that one type of conscious being sees themselves as immersed in reality. The other kind of conscious being sees himself as somehow standing above and beyond reality, dominating, controlling nature. So this distinction thematically between these two mindsets shows up both in what O'Hare says about self-consciousness and Eisler on cultural consciousness. O'Hare also, in one paper she presented, which I also found fascinating, a three-way distinction on consciousness between defensive protective consciousness, which emphasizes order, psychotic chaotic consciousness, and growth consciousness, which pursues evolution, which is some kind of unity of order and chaos, so the orderly and chaotic parts of human consciousness. And I bring that one up here because often when we see people's theories of the future of consciousness based upon their thoughts regarding current consciousness, what they will argue is that we are imbalanced consciously, and what we need to realize is greater integration or balance between opposing or complementary modes of consciousness. Oh, here's an example of that. So, if consciousness in some way or another is this complementarity or duality of mindsets, of perspectives, then the goal should be to integrate them better together, which we haven't done. Okay, so we tend to end up in dualistic mindsets when we should end up in reciprocal mindsets. Now, I should just also mention two significant books which were written on feminist views on morality and the development of morality, and feminist views on human knowledge and the development of human knowledge. Those two books I have up there, and A Different Voice and Women Ways of Knowing. And again, we see this contrast between women thinkers describing humanity or human consciousness as somehow embedded in, immersed in reality, where men tend to go in the other direction and tend to look at consciousness as somehow separate or detached from reality. Now, that's not, I don't mean that in some kind of absolute fashion, but just simply as a general difference that shows up. So, later on, I'm going to talk in the next webinar about, how would aliens conceptualize consciousness if they were conscious? And, most of the people who have written about consciousness and their ideas have been recorded have tended to be males. And so one wonders if the male mentality is inclined to conceptualize things in reality a certain way. And if you were to ask women writers, women psychologists, women philosophers, how they would conceptualize consciousness, you might notice a distinctive difference, a difference in pattern, a difference in way of looking at it. So it's important to look at, women writers and feminist theories of consciousness. So I think at that point I will stop for today. Um, and close it out, and we will do